Hello and welcome to this podcast on controversies and issues in global sports. There's almost two parts, or we're thinking about this podcast in two parts. The first part is going to look specifically at the way in which controversies in global sport are resolved, and we're going to lean specifically on the Court of Arbitration for Sport here. And then the second half of the podcast, we're going to look at the negative consequences of the globalization of sport and the issues with this. So to start with, let's talk about the Court of Arbitration in Sport, or CAS as it's more commonly abbreviated to. It was created specifically to address sports-related matters and controversies. Since its formation, it's addressed a wide range of sports-related challenges, including matters pertaining to the positive drug tests of athletes, the challenges to technical decisions of officials made during competition, and the eligibility of athletes to compete in Olympic Games. Of significance, CAS awards have been recognised as developing a lex sportiva, that is, a set of guiding principles and rules in international sports law. It's probably worth highlighting here that, in particular, CAS has been designated as the exclusive arbitrary body for Olympic disputes. The World Anti-Doping Agency, or WADA as we know it, has designated the CAS as the exclusive arbitrary body for doping matters occurring during international events or involving international level athletes. And international sports federations are designating CAS as the exclusive arbitrary body for their disputes. It's based in Lausanne in Switzerland, which you might remember is also the venue for the formation of WADA in the late 90s, and has been operational, as I say, since 1984. We can see here how CAS fits into that kind of global network of organizations that we've spoken about. So we've got WADA that work here. We've got National Anti-Doping Organization arbitration tribunals. We've got International Sports Federation arbitration tribunals as well, such as FIFA's Disputes Resolution Chamber, that will funnel through cases to CAS which they can't resolve themselves. So a number of these sports governing bodies themselves are putting cases through to WADA. So a couple of years after it was formed in 1984, there was only two disputes that were brought before CAS, while by 2016, so just under 10 years ago, that number had grown to 609. So there's been quite a large rise in the number of cases that CAS have dealt with over time, and you can see in this graph on the right-hand side here, the rise in the number of cases that CAS has had to deal with. Since in 2020, there was a genuine surge in the number of disputes that were adjudicated by CAS, as in total 959 disputes were brought before CAS. That is an increase by almost 60% compared to the previous year. In total, statistics show that CAS handled 7,869 disputes since its modest start in 1984, the large majority of which were filed in the last 5 to 10 years. In terms of some of the more notable cases that you might have heard of that CAS have dealt with, their decisions, especially appeals, are often pretty high profile because they've obviously not been able to be agreed within that sport itself, and they generate an immense amount of press coverage and sometimes controversy. Some that you might be familiar with, one of which was Manchester City. They had been charged for breaking financial fair play regulations, and they were going to potentially be kicked out of European competition. UEFA had banned City from all European competitions for 3 years and fined it heavily. However, CAS, following a kind of appeal from Manchester City, overturned the decision, ruling that UEFA hadn't proved that City's financial dealings violated applicable rules. So they were able to find a way to avoid being fined and banned from European competitions. Then if we go back to the start of the 21st century, it was a Romanian gymnast challenged the IOC, a doping ban that stripped her of her gold medal at the Sydney Olympics. The athlete claimed that she had tested positive for banned substances after ingesting cold and flu tablets prescribed by her doctor. CAS upheld her ban anyway, ruling that the anti-doping code must be enforced without compromise. So an interesting one here, which involves WADA and the WADA code, which we've previously discussed. A couple of others here, perhaps the most recent high-profile one beyond Manchester City is the IOC, and a lot of you will have mentioned this within your podcast, but the nature of the Russian athletes following the revelations of the doping scandal The IOC had banned a number of Russian athletes from the upcoming Winter Olympics after a massive doping scandal. CAS could overturn most of the bans for a lack of evidence and reduce the length of the few bans it did uphold, much to the IOC's dismay. I think they were quite angry at the decision that CAS had overturned this decision. So Russian athletes were able to compete in the Winter Games. CAS also paved the way forward for Gibraltar to enter UEFA from FIFA, issuing a series of decisions forcing the federations to recognise the British overseas territory as well. So they've been involved in a kind of a wide range. You can see some doping scandals here, but also quite a lot to do with football. And they do tend to be its two main sports, athletics and doping, and football in particular. So it's faced I think it's fair to say it's faced a fair amount of criticism since it was established in the 80s. The main criticism has been about its lack of independence and impartiality. And if you think back to some of the criticisms we spoke about with WADA, the same thing tends to apply because of their close relationship with the IOC and other prominent sports governing bodies. And due to the nature of the funding of CAS, which comes from the IOC and some of these bodies, there is a criticism for its lack of impartiality at times and tends to favour with these sports governing bodies. However, as we've seen, it isn't afraid to pave its own way forward, as from the case study, I guess, of the Russian athletes who were successful in overturning their ban. So there's some pros and cons to weigh up, and I would point you in the direction of this article by Suella de Vichy, which is worth looking into further and really explores that question of the independence of CAS. Okay, so that deals with how controversies can often be resolved, and particularly on that kind of global scale. As I say, they do tend to be between sports governing bodies and athletes, and when sport can't particularly resolve it. And it is the kind of culmination of this globalization, essentially. And I think as well, when we go back to that slide around the number of cases, as the nature of sport has become more globalized, so too have the number of cases that CAS have faced. And that could be because of globalization, it could be of the increased professionalism as well. So there's a number of different factors that are worth considering within why CAS has become more and more prominent within resolving some of these disputes. So let's now think about globalization more broadly. So not perhaps controversies that need to be resolved, but perhaps some of the issues and some of the negative consequences of globalization. So although there are many virtues associated with the global movement in sport, globalization has not been favorable for all and presents important drawbacks that must be understood and respected. In fact, some argue that the globalization of sport has been achieved at the expense of individuals, organizations, and countries with limited resources. And if you think back to some of the discussions we've had about the westernization of sport and the lens through which we view sport, who often tends to miss out on or lose out on the globalization of sport, or people often that can't tell their own narratives, and very much thinking about that first lecture and that first seminar we had around the transition of sport from west to east and how that sometimes very, very occasionally is bucked. The globalization of sport may in large part have been achieved on the backs of the poor. This lecture and this kind of second half of our podcast is going to examine some of the negative consequences of the globalization of sport, along with an overview of how issues crossing borders can be resolved. So where does sport fit into conversations regarding globalization? So in the context of sport, Tomlinson and Young remind us that FIFA is more global than the United Nations, since FIFA has a membership of 208 countries, while the UN membership is 192 countries. Along similar lines, the IOC is also larger in scope than United Nations. And Giulianotti and Robertson note that Olympianism has a global political reach, with 203 national Olympic committees affiliated to the IOC, giving 11 more national members than the UN. Furthermore, there are a number of sports organizations that yield a great deal of power in the world. Organizations such as FIFA, the IOC, and the National Basketball Association play an important role in the new sport world order. We're currently seeing the role that sport is playing with Qatar's nation-building efforts, Saudi Arabia's nation-building efforts, and you have seen throughout this module, in many ways, globalization has been beneficial for the sport. For example, the diversity in athletes' origins participating in many of the professional sports leagues around the world, such as the Ladies Professional Golf Association and the Association of Tennis Professionals, the Women's Tennis Association, the NBA, and the English Premier League. Also noteworthy is the increasing number of countries participating in international sports events. For example, Azerbaijan, Kenya, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, Uruguay, and Venezuela participated in their first Olympic Winter Games in 1998 in Japan. And in addition to this, there's an increasing number of athletes are participating from a more diverse range of backgrounds in sports, often crossing some gender and religious lines and climate barriers as well. For example, Muslim women participating in sports such as rugby and football, the participation of Jamaican athletes in bobsleigh at the 1988 Winter Olympics in Calgary, the Australian gold medal winning victory of Steve Bradbury in short track speed skating at the 2002 Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City, and an increased access to winter sports in tropical climates as well, via snow domes where sports such as downhill skiing, snowboarding, and ice skating take place indoors. We could also include the broader and increasing opportunity athletes, coaches, and leaders have been able to access because of the global nature of sport. So these are all positive things that we need to think about in terms of globalization, and we've looked at some of these over the course of the module. However, despite these positives, there are a number of negatives associated with the globalization of sport. In fact, some argue that the globalization of sport has been achieved at the expense of individuals with limited resources, and that the globalization of sport may in large part have been achieved on the backs of the poor. As you can see from the quote on screen here, for all its virtues, globalization is not without its drawbacks, widening chasms between rich and poor societies, plummeting environmental standards, and increasing dependency on outsourcing. Peril is riding tandem with so much promise, which is to say globalization is like sports. For all the winners, there are necessarily losers as well. And we're going to look at three main issues over the course of this podcast. They being the kind of division of labor undertaken at an international scale, where transnational corporations, indeed some nations, are drawing on developing countries' workforce to manufacture stadia, sportswear, and sports equipment. Where they're going to look at the increasing flow of athletes where country of birth and origin are no longer a limitation on where an athlete plays and competes, and the impact of sport on the environment. So let's start here with the sports industry and the use of developing nations' workforces. So in the sports industry, the production of goods is largely achieved in developing countries through the use of subcontractors hired by major corporations such as Nike, Adidas, Puma, and Fila. The workforce responsible for the production of these sporting goods endures to this day, and they endure pitiful working conditions. Even with public pressure originating from special interest groups such as the International Labour Organization, the Workers' Rights Consortium, and Fair Labour Association based in developed countries, transnational corporations are still complicit in perpetuating the poor working conditions in these factories. Even though transnational corporations have developed codes of conduct and ethical guidelines, these codes and guidelines have not, for the most part, translated into real positive change in the operations of subcontractors and the treatment of workers in developing countries. Transnational corporations have to assume part of the responsibility for the low wages, long hours, lack of job security, and dismal and dangerous work conditions. As noted in the Playfair at the Olympics 2004 report, if labour exploitation were an Olympic sport, the sportswear giants would be well represented amongst the medal winners. Okay, so what I'll do now is include a short film around some of these issues that we've spoken about, and this is in the context of Nike. Please note there might be some distressing content here, so this is just a warning.
Evidence. It's no great secret that designer sportswear is made in remote factories by poorly paid workers. But what's going on here in Malaysia is something altogether more sinister. It's human trafficking on a massive scale. Here's how it works. Recruiters in poverty-stricken countries offer desperate men and women guaranteed work in Malaysia. But there's a catch, an upfront fee, the equivalent of a year's wages. Now they're in debt. On arrival, their passports are confiscated. Now they're trapped. Then, like these Vietnamese workers we met at a secret location, they must sign 3-year contracts in a language they can't read. It's a virtual prison. To leave, they must buy out their debt and buy back their passports. But they're paid so little, escape is impossible.
What they say in here is, oh, they've been trapped and they've been lied to.
We can also look at the example of the Qatar World Cup, something which has cropped up quite a lot over the course of the module. And if we think about this kind of sourcing of individuals to support the development of stadia, perhaps the Qatar World Cup is our best case study, and we can look at the number of deaths. This was from The Guardian, looking at the number of deaths in the country of origin, South Asian migrants, since Qatar was awarded the right to host the World Cup in 2010. So let's move on to the migration of athletes, our second kind of key issue with the globalization of sport. And in the context of a global economy, the movement of workers between countries is not unusual. In fact, in many cases, it is encouraged. In sport, the migration of athletes refers to the movement of athletes from one country to another, generally to access more resources, whether it is financial compensation or better coaching, equipment, and support services for their sport involvement. Migration may also occur to facilitate the athlete's achievement of his or her ultimate goal of being selected to a country's Olympic team or signing on to a professional league. In the recruitment of international athletes in the National Collegiate Athletic Association, it has been written, player movement in international athletics is essentially sport's version of free trade. The global connection through sport and the increasing presence of international athletes are generally welcome and beneficial. The of talent increases the quality of competition for the consumer fan and the strength of athletic programs at colleges and universities. Although athlete migration has been favorable for the coaches, teams, leagues, organizations, and nations benefiting from the access to better talent, it has also been identified as problematic. For example, concerns over the massive exodus of Kenyan athletes to other countries and the drain on their own talent pool has been raised by Kenyan officials when 8 Kenyan athletes migrated to the affluent Persian Gulf nations of Qatar and Bahrain. Qatar and Bahrain lured the athletes in with the promises of generous benefits and lifetime pensions. When a developing country's investment in sports systems are reaped by other countries, it is disconcerting. Although Kenya athletes who migrated have personally benefited from the opportunities afforded by Qatar and Bahrain, Kenyan sports system was skilled with the loss of these athletes. Increasingly, country sports leaders appear to be involved in the recruitment of athletes from other countries in order to be competitive in international sports events. For example, prior to the 2006 Torino Winter Olympics, leaders from the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia were recruiting Canadian talent to fill their ice hockey team. As noted by Western, the IOC has a rule that addresses nationality, where athletes are required to be citizens of a country which they represent in the Olympic Games. Despite this, application of nationality rules becomes dubious when countries grant citizenship to star foreign athletes on the eve of the Games. Athlete migration has led in some instances to what Maguire and Bale term the de-skilling of donor countries. They argue that Latin and Central American countries regularly experience the loss of baseball and soccer players to the US and Europe. They further explained less developed nations have invested in nurturing talent. Once this talent reaches maturity, more economically developed leagues such as the Major League Baseball cream off the best. Native audience are thus denied direct access to native talent nurtured and developed in their countries. As further evidence of the impact of athlete migration, the Greek softball and baseball 2004 Olympic teams are an example where most of the athletes on both teams were born in the United States. Even though the United States did not qualify for baseball for the 2004 Olympic Games, American baseball players were well represented. 20 were Americans, 1 was Canadian, and 2 were Greek. For softball, the situation was similar. 14 athletes were Americans, whilst 2 were Greek. These athletes all became Greek citizens in time for the Olympic Games and were excused from Greece's 2-year rule. Although this provided the chosen athletes with opportunities to participate in the Olympic Games, Greek-born athletes were essentially overlooked when team members were selected. In the case of professional baseball and Major League Baseball in particular, questions about siphoning talent out of the country or what has been called poaching, along with exploitative practices in recruiting players from Central and South America, have been raised. The unequal access to resources in Central America and South America relative to the United States has in some cases facilitated the migration of athletes and has as well perpetuated these inequalities. In other examples, in other cases, the internationalization of leagues such as football in Europe may have enhanced the profile of teams in these leagues amongst fans, media, sponsors, and advertisers across the globe. However, it may have undermined the success of domestic leagues in certain countries, for example, the Brazilian Football League. We've also looked at the issue of foreign ownership of sports clubs within this module, and it's also worth touching upon at this point. So related to the migration of athletes, foreign ownership of professional sports franchises has also generated a great deal of controversy. And we can think back to 2005 when the Glazer family took control of Manchester United, which led and sparked protests amongst the Manchester United fan base. We can look at the kind of Americanization of the Premier League and how, to some extent, this was a major factor in the European Super League debacle as well. So thinking about how this transition of ownership of British football teams collides with some of the values that we have about football clubs in the UK. And actually, if you can look at this article on the right that I've sourced, you can see this kind of the number of switches that clubs have made over the past 60 years or so. Okay, so we've looked at the issues here of the migration of talent and the issue of the use of workforces in the formation of sporting goods and stadia. But what about sport's impact upon the environment, particularly the globalization of sport? Well, as we know, sport makes a significant impact on the environment. A study was undertaken at the Centre of Business Relationships, Accountability, Sustainability and Society at Cardiff University in Wales, where the ecological footprint of rugby supporters was assessed during one game of the 2006 Rugby Six Nations tournament. Although the researchers acknowledged the important economic benefits of the event for the Cardiff economy, they also point out the significant environmental cost paid by the city. Their research demonstrates that the energy resources used by 86,000 rugby fans resulted in the ecological footprint equivalent to the area of 3,500 rugby pitches. Furthermore, the researchers argued that the largest impact on the ecological footprint resulted from supporters' food and drink consumption. A total of 66.5 tonnes of waste were generated during the event, of which approximately 1% was recycled. The ecological footprint was further affected by the travel to and from the Millennium Stadium in Cardiff. The researchers estimated that a total of 24.3 million kilometres travelled by supporters for the game. This translated into an average of 284 kilometres per supporter. And based on the number of sport events held throughout the world, our ecological footprint related to sport is fairly immense, and for the most part goes unnoticed. Another example where sport has not been so kind to the environment is in downhill skiing. In preparation for the 1998 Olympic Winter Games, the Federation of Skiing wanted to extend the length of men's downhill course by 122 meters. However, Japan, who were hosting the games, did not want to extend the course, citing it would be damaging and have an adverse ecological effect on a sensitive area of the mountain. Initial concerns for vegetation and wildlife were set aside to ensure a longer downhill ski course for athletes. Still on the theme of winter sports is the building of snow domes to allow individuals living in countries where they did not experience the real winter to practice sports such as downhill skiing, snowboarding and skating. There are approximately 50 snow domes currently operating in 20 countries: UK, Indonesia, Taiwan, Malaysia, China. These facilities cover the space of 3 football fields and use the equivalent of 15,000 domestic refrigerators to keep the dome's temperatures between -1 degree and -7 degrees Celsius, to support snowmaking equipment that makes 30 tons of snow every night to maintain snow levels in the facility. In another example of sports impact on the environment, golf has been a concern. Even though golf is associated with the great outdoors and individuals' harmony with nature, the development and maintenance of golf courses negatively affects wildlife and vegetation, not to mention the depletion of water resources required for the upkeep of the greens. Golf courses are usually built near ecologically sensitive areas, and then once developed, chemicals such as fertilizers and pesticides are used to maintain the greens, further damaging the environment. As explained by Maguire, building a golf course involves the clearing of natural vegetation and destroys natural landscapes and habitats. Trees, shrubbery, hedgerows, and plants are destroyed. Hilltops are bulldozed and valleys are filled in to create an artificial golf landscape. So to conclude, in choosing labour and environmental issues as evidence of some of the inconvenient truths of the globalisation of sport, this isn't to suggest that we stop taking part in sport, that we stop buying sportswear and sports equipment, that we prevent athletes from migrating to other countries, and that we stop building sports facilities or we stop holding events. The point is really to think about the increased awareness that we need to have regarding the perils of globalisation and these negative aspects of it. In developed countries, the issue of consensus around the other side of globalization of sport is not always high, as individuals are bombarded by positive examples and outcomes of globalization. And I think what we're looking for is an increased sensitivity regarding the cost of globalizations for individuals in developed countries, for their sport system and for their country. It may be inconvenient for us to ask what are we willing to give up to protect sport and the sport industry and to ensure a more globally egalitarian situation with regard to sport. In other words, are we in developed nations willing to share the wealth with all countries and organizations involved in all of the labor used in sport? Should rich professional leagues in developed countries invest a proportion of their profits in countries where they acquire talent for their teams and leagues? These profits could be invested in a sports system to ensure talent development and ongoing support for countries' support systems. So I suppose really the point here is to think about globalization more critically and have an increased awareness really around some of the issues and pitfalls that come and the adverse effects of globalization. And I hope that you have enjoyed this podcast. Thank you for listening.